Welcome to the Confessions Podcast. I'm Cindy Wagman.
And I'm Jess Campbell. We're two former in-house nonprofit pros turned coaches and consultants to purpose-driven organizations.
After years of building up our separate six-figure businesses from scratch, we've thrown a lot of spaghetti at the wall and have lived to see what sticks.
We're on a mission to help other nonprofit coaches and consultants looking to start or scale their own businesses past the six-figure mark by pulling back the curtain.
Whether you're still working inside a nonprofit and thinking of one day going out on your own, or you've been running your consulting business for years, you understand that working with nonprofits is just different. We're giving you access to the business leaders who serve nonprofits as their clients. You know, the people who truly get it.
No more gatekeeping, no more secrets. This podcast is going to give you an inside look at what running a successful nonprofit coaching and consulting business looks like. Basically, we're asking people how much money they make, how they get paid, and what has and hasn't worked in their businesses.
Listen in as these leaders share their insights, their numbers, and the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to building a nonprofit coaching or consulting business. We're going to empower you to make the power moves that give you the income and freedom you set out to create from day one.
You ready? Let's go. We're so pumped you've tuned into the Confessions Podcast, where we're pulling back the curtain on all things nonprofit coaching and consulting. To keep things super fun, we're doing a giveaway to celebrate our launch.
Woohoo! We've rounded up our 4 favorite business goodies to help you build your business. To enter, all you have to do is share your favorite episode on social media, tagging outintheboons_ and cindywagman.com_coaching.
Or DM us a screenshot of your subscription, rating, or review.
The giveaway ends on September 30th. Good luck.
Hey, Jess. Hi, Cindy. It's going to be fun.
This is so fun. This is our first episode where it's just Jess and I, but instead of having a guest, we actually have one of you listeners who called in anonymously to share your own confession or question that we're going to chat about. So if you haven't checked out that function, go to our website. It's on the main menu. You can send us a voice message, and we will talk about it.
Yes, ask us anything. Clearly, we're open books.
We're so open. So with that, we're going to play you the audio that was sent to us, and then we will chat about it. Here you go.
I really struggle with feeling that I'm good enough or qualified enough to put my fundraising skills in action as a consultant, or to look into like coaching or consulting as a business. And I feel like probably a lot of that has to do with imposter syndrome and, being a young professional female in the workspace. And I'm curious what kind of feedback or support you guys can suggest for, feeling worthy, I guess, of even starting your own consultancy. And how do you jump in? How do you feel confident in that choice?
Oof. All the feels with that one.
I know. It just reminds me of moments I still have. I was going to say moments from a past life business, Jess, but like, let's be straight. I still have moments where I have imposter syndrome.
Oh, we all do. And like, there's a saying, I'm totally going to butcher it, but like, if you don't have... the fact that you have imposter syndrome means you're probably not an imposter. If you don't ever have imposter syndrome, then you should be worried about you being overly confident. But it is something we all struggle with. And we've heard other podcast guests talk about this, but we thought this was a good opportunity to deep dive into it a little bit more and have that conversation. And of course, we'd love to hear everyone's thoughts to share with us on social and everywhere else. But for me, what really comes up, and I love what you're going to see about Jess and I, is we have different approaches. And so for me, what comes up is, the stories that we tell ourselves that are running through our brains around, our worthiness. And I have a consultant on our team. When she started, she definitely suffered from imposter syndrome and not feeling worthy. And when we started to unpack that, it was one of her boss's voices that was like on autopilot in her brain. And this was a boss who micromanaged, who told her that her work wasn't great, wanted to see everything and just made her feel like crap. And for her to go out and consult felt really overwhelming because she just couldn't shake that voice. And we had to do a lot of work on that.
Yeah, interesting. It's, I don't know, I'm sitting here thinking, just because I don't necessarily know your story, and as someone that looks up to you in your business, you've been running your business longer than me. And anytime I've personally kind of come to our peer mastermind with my own imposter syndrome, you like always have the answer, and like you always seem so confident. I'm just curious, like, what is your imposter syndrome hang up? Like, where does that rear its ugly little head in your head or in your business?
Oh, I mean, it's one of those situations where, we're always better at giving advice and living by that advice. So I'm glad I come across as confident in having all my shit together, but I've struggled with imposter syndrome literally my whole career. Especially in the early days, I was young in the roles that I held, and I look young for my age. Thank you to my genes. And so I always felt that people were kind of looking at me that way and not taking me seriously. And also that shows up in how I approach my business. I actually want to be authentic and fun. And so I definitely have moments where I feel like, am I professional enough? Am I polished enough? One of my goals for myself in my business over the next year is to really get better at speaking on stages and booking more. I have like probably 7 speaking arrangements this fall, 2 in person. And that's an area where I still feel major imposter syndrome. Is enough that I've invested in a training program to help me be a better speaker. But I've asked for feedback from people and like, you're fine. I'm like, no, that's not helpful. So I think finding the balance for me around, doing things scared and doing things imperfectly has been something that I've taught myself a lot over time.
Yeah, it's definitely a muscle that needs to be flexed and exercised, because I don't think anyone's just, born super, super like confident. I will say, growing up, my mom did a really great job. I have to say, I've always been kind of confident and a leader. In fact, when I would go to school in the morning, instead of saying, I love you, she would say, be a leader. And it's something I say to my daughter on the way to school. I
love that.
Yeah. And so, that combined with me being the eldest child and just all sorts of things. The other thing she would do for me is, my whole life, I was always beautiful. I was never pretty. I was always smart. She really focused on these non-physical kind of attributes. And so with that, I think for a lot of women who struggle with their appearance specifically, and not just physically, but then that translate into like how you show up, like online everywhere, and in your voice and all these things. Like, I haven't struggled with that, and not to blame everything on my mother, that will be for a therapy appointment. The one thing that I think sometimes it was never like shoot for the stars. It was always be practical. And so I think sometimes I struggle with worthiness around and confidence, specifically around money. That will probably come up a lot in these confession podcast episodes. This like, don't ask for too much, or like, don't demand too much, like this worthiness component. So it shows up everywhere in all ways, shapes, and sizes. And, to respond to the listeners' question around what do you do about that? I mean, I think that there is a time where looking outward and gaining inspiration, there's no such thing, there's no original things, right? So like gaining inspiration, mimicking what other people that you like are doing, getting inspiration from, that's all great. But then when you start to have those little thoughts of like, oh, they do it better than me, or, oh, they're so much a better storyteller, they're more clever, I really love their branding, or blah, 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 then it's like, turn that off. Because I know for me in my business, I may or may not be the best, copywriter, fundraiser, asker of money, but people really like my vibe and my personality. And it's a really clear distinction of someone who's like way more buttoned up or from a really large multi-million dollar organization. Like, I'm not going to be your vibe. You're not going to be mine. And like, that's okay.
Bye. And I love that, because I love a lot of things you just said, but one of the things actually that I want to double down on is this idea of when to turn things off, when to shut out the outside world, because I do this, and I've been seeing this a lot lately, where we're consuming, especially for people who are early days in their business or making a pivot or growing their business in some way, they start to consume everything, right? So I'll give you me as an example. I'm like, should I do VIP days? So now I'm like, oh, there's a VIP day conference, and there's another VIP day conference, and I'm going to listen to this VIP day podcast, and we need to like survey the environment. But there's a point where, and there's 2 points. One is there's a point where you got to like commit and actually do the deeper learning, not just the like light stuff. But then there's also a point where when you commit to the deeper learning, turn everything else off. Just let it go, because it's going, like, I love where I just have one process I need to follow, and I follow it through to the end, and no other ideas are relevant at that point. And when you're starting to build your business, or taking a big leap, like, do your research. And as you said, turn the rest off and do it your way, because nothing else matters at that point.
One thing I'll also say that I see out a lot in the nonprofit coaching and consulting world that to me screams imposter syndrome, but I don't think people are like noticing that way, is they put out content that serves nonprofit coaches and consultants. And like, that's fine if that's who your audience is. But if your audience is still nonprofits, why are you putting out content that only like nonprofit coaches and consultants are going to either want to consume, comment on, engage with? It just, I'm like, it's like wanting the validation for the engagement and the interaction, which I totally get, but like, it's not cultivating the audience you're trying to build, and thus you're not going to get business from it. And it's just this like really slight tweak, but I've noticed it everywhere. And I'm like, what is up with that? And I'm like, oh, it's that.
Yeah. So when I started consulting, I felt like there was this like group of the cool kids of consultants. And I was like, notice me. And I found that they were predominantly on Twitter at the time. And I spent time there. Or first of all, I don't like Twitter. I'm not really good at Twitter. I'm not great at social media, period, but that's just not my jam. But I was like, I felt this obligation to be seen and this need to be validated by that crowd. And exactly what you're saying, like I was not engaging in conversations there that were for my audience. Those were conversations for the cool kids, and they all communicated with themselves, and they were all busy enough in their businesses that I don't even think they do a lot of business development. But I'm like, why am I spending my time trying to get noticed by people who are not my core audience? And there is something to be said about networks and referrals. I actually think referral based business development is one of the best ways to grow your business. So you can have those relationships, but does it need to be like on a platform that's not aligned to your audience, and just the sake of being there is so that you can get noticed. So I totally went through that myself.
Interesting. Yeah, it's just been something I've been noticing, and it's listen, like I'm not a business coach for them, so I'm not gonna like help people course correct, but I've just been very curious if it's a function of imposter syndrome that results in that type of content.
100%.
So I mean, is there anything else for someone who's really struggling with how to combat imposter syndrome outside of like muting things, turning off once you've done your research, or just anything else that you would advise people? I mean, I think one thing that's super healthy is like therapy. Like we struggle with imposter syndrome
Find yourself
all
a
over the
coach.
place.
Find yourself a coach or a therapist. But I think understanding what your imposter syndrome is, like how it shows up for you, as I said, like whose voice do you have in your head? You have your mom's voice. We all have our parents' voices. But we also have our former bosses' voices and
our spouses, our everyone,
clients. If you have a not so good client experience, that sticks with you for a while. So it's actually very specific work where you have to unpack what that voice is telling you and why, and so that you can counteract that. And then the other thing I'll say is, one of the things I hear a lot from people is, well, someone's already done that, right? Like, am I ever going to be as good as Joan Gary? I mean, she's killing it out there. And like, don't even try. And so the more people there are out there who are doing work and successful doing the work that you want to do, means there's a proven market for it. And so there's a proven market, and you have your own approach, your own authentic personality, as we talked about before. And those two combined is completely unique. And so don't let that stop you. I hear that from so many people. Well, like, so-and-so's doing it better. I'm like, that's okay. It just means people are willing to pay for it.
And it doesn't even mean better, right? Like I went to, I know you're in Canada, so I don't know if you have this, but I went to a store called Smart and Final over the weekend because that was the closest grocery store. And I normally shop at a store called Trader Joe's, which has like a very limited,
we all know
branded.
Trader Joe's.
But I'm in Smart and Final and I go to like the chip aisle, and there was literally like 152 different chip options. And so it's like, if someone just gave up after like there was one or two chip brands, like the world would be deprived of so many yummy snacks. And again, it just goes back to the fact that the reason why people are going to want to work with you is because of your skill set, your ability to execute all these things, right? But it's also your personality or your vibe. Or like I personally have made a decision where I don't know, 95% of my professional development, I want to invest it in female, BIPOC, badass women. And so, you know, if that is you, you're more likely to get my personal business than even someone in a different category. So, you know, it's all a combination. And I think what you said about really noticing where that voice is, so you can be like, is this a real thought, or is this that little imposter syndrome thought? And then, I don't know, do you have any tools for folks? Like, what do you coach people on? Let's just get like a mini lesson from you. Like breathing, walking, what is it?
So it's actually, there's sort of a two-step. So it's a multi-step, but we'll start with like the short form. One is just bringing awareness. So catching that voice when you hear it, so that you know it's there, right? Most of the time it's so automated in our brain that it feels like the truth, and our brain actually uses it as a lens to see the world. So we have to bring awareness to it because it's hidden from us most days. So you can definitely do things like journaling, or just writing things down. Sometimes just keeping a little piece of paper where you're like, oh my goodness, I just had that thought. I'm going to write it down. And then you want to start to find evidence against it. So these beliefs are combined thoughts and emotions. So thoughts are logical, right? They're like, put on your lawyer hat. This is like all the evidence. And so when we try and change a belief, we have to use the thoughtful and the emotional. So we have to find the evidence that shows us we're wrong. So questions like, well, is this always true? Or can I think of an example when it's not true? Or where there's evidence that I was successful or that I have these skills. But again, these should be very specific to your personal negative thoughts and beliefs. And then the emotional side, actually, one of the things that I find the most helpful is to imagine that someone you love and care about just said what you said to yourself. Because we're terrible at self-talk, but, and I kind of like did this with my husband the other day, where he said something that was really negative about himself. And I said, what would you do if one of the kids said that? How would you feel? Like, what would you tell them? And that's the emotional side, which is like, oh my goodness. And that, just totally changed his perspective. So
thought about it.
we all have like a dominant thought versus emotion, like logic versus emotion. Like I'm dominant logic. So start where you're, where you may be dominant, but they always combine. They always are there together, and you have to work on both of them. And then you have to practice, right? And there's no better way. The way our brains automate is through repetition. And so sometimes it's just getting really comfortable at doing things scared, and doing it over and over and over again, so that your brain starts to change its shortcuts.
I'm really curious, because you are such the expert in coaching people through this, what your opinion or advice is on bringing in others. So like the way you did it for your husband in that example, like, because I feel like it's a delicate balance around getting validation in your business and then like too many cooks in the kitchen. So I'm curious what you think about, when you're having an imposter syndrome moment, reaching out to either a network of people who understand your business or your couple of loyal friends and being like, is this true, or is this imposter syndrome? Or if you think it's more important to just really practice that skill set of coaching yourself.
I think it's a combination. I think we need to learn how to self-coach, because at the end of the day, that's the only, it's just us. But it's really, really hard sometimes to see things. And actually, one of the things I did this past summer that was scary as hell for me was I invited my husband into the things that I was working on personally with my coach, because I wanted his perspective to show me things that I couldn't see myself. And so I think, and I will say, like, we've had our own little sort of our mastermind, and sort of have a retreat that we do together, where we'll sit down and like, we will see things differently from each other. And so I think we need that. Obviously, as a coach, I think coaches are incredibly helpful. I also think therapists are very valuable. And I do think having a peer who understands, and who you trust, and who understands working with nonprofits and running a business, is really, I know for me, it's been really helpful just to get it so quickly. You don't have to explain and all of that.
Totally. Well, I hope for everyone listening that, has imposter syndrome, which is 100% of folks, because to say that you don't is a lie. I hope that this is helpful. And I just think that the key takeaways around, muting where you need to mute, recognizing that inner dialogue, coaching yourself, learning how to coach yourself through it, that logical versus emotional balance, pulling in a network or a small group of people who really get it is so important. I mean, that's really like what the foundation of this whole podcast is about. I hope it's been helpful.
Yeah. And we want to hear from you. Just a reminder, please do leave us a message. We love having these conversations. I mean, Jess and I will talk forever and ever on all the things, but we want to make sure we are talking about the things you want to hear about. So go visit confessionswithjessandcindy.com nonprofitcoach.com and click the link in the menu and you just leave a voice recording. All right, we'll see you next week.
Bye.
Thank you again for listening to the Confessions podcast for nonprofit coaches and consultants. If you enjoyed today's episode, which I sure hope you did, you can show your support in one of 3 ways.
Number 1, post a screenshot of this episode to your Instagram stories or LinkedIn profile and tag Cindy and I so we can repost you.
Number 2, share this podcast with a fellow nonprofit coach or consultant.
And number 3, leave a positive review on Apple Podcasts so we can continue to grow and reach new listeners.
And of course, make sure you subscribe so you can get the latest and greatest interviews as they drop every Thursday.
And to our fellow nonprofit coaching and consulting friends, remember, we're an open book and here to answer your burning biz questions.
See you next time.